regardless.
Okay, good evening. I think we can get started. Welcome to all of you here in the room as well as those on Zoom. I'm Sylvia Waisford, Professor and Director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. And today we're going to talk about covering war, the war in Ukraine. There's so much that we can talk about. A week into the invasion of the Ukraine, so many angles, so many issues. Of course, it's a complex story, multiple stories at the same time, and we only have 1 hour here. Our intention is that we're going to focus on issues that are central to the mission of the school. We're going to talk about war, media, journalism, communication, and I'm sure there are going to be other issues related to geopolitics, sanctions, military actions that we can address as well. My intention is probably to go to from the general to specific topics. So I will ask our three panelists to start talking about their general impressions of what they have seen, what they have watched in the last week. I'm pleased to have three colleagues that I highly esteem here, three experts on the subject in our school. Let me introduce Dr. Shona Day, who is Associate Professor of Media and Public Affairs, and has written extensively on news and war and teaches on the subject in the school, I believe in the fall semester. Our second speaker is Tom Shanker, who's Director of the Project for Media and National Security. He's a former New York Times Pentagon correspondent and former foreign correspondent based in Moscow, Berlin, and Sarajevo. Welcome, Tom. Thank you. And Megan Stack, who is our current Shapiro Fellow and is an alumna of the school. She's an author and award-winning war correspondent who reported from dozens of countries and was posted to Jerusalem, Cairo, Moscow, Beijing, Kabul, and many other places. She's a contributing writer to the opinion page of the New York Times, and she's the author of a recent piece called "In Russia, I Learned Threats Were Always Real." It came out yesterday. Thank you very much. So let's get started. Let me start with a general question. Of course, we're going to have plenty of time for questions from you as well as people on Zoom. If we get to the invasion, what would you say are some of the most interesting, striking aspects of what we have seen in terms of the coverage, communication, media issues? Tom, you want to start?
Sure. People like Megan and Anthony, who spend a lot of time living in conflict zones, learn a couple of things. The first is a cliche. When you go cover a war, the war covers you. It changes you forever. The second thing that isn't quite as obvious is that wars happen going forward, but they're only understood going backwards. And this has accelerated this problem by social media. We were talking before this started about this amazing social media story about these brave Ukrainians who are defending Snake Island. They insulted the Russian attackers using a word bomb that I won't say here, and died for it. Well, now we've learned, still tragic, they were captured, but they weren't killed. Yet this became this incredibly powerful story. And so the problem with this first Wired war or TikTok war is that individual threads of a story are misinterpreted as the entire tapestry. I mean, early on, individual social media stories about the brave Ukrainians standing up to the Russians led to a narrative that the invasion had stalled. But Putin absolutely maintains escalation dominance. This war will go on as long as he wants, will be as violent as he wants, but those early social media threads were misinterpreted. And that is such a danger in our interconnected world.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that carry off of that we see here, that we see often, particularly in this last 20 years of socially mediated wars, is always a kind of tunnel vision that happens that's sort of natural to what you guys do, which is reporting from the ground. And there's a tendency for narratives to develop and sort of a kind of pack journalism, if you will, which is usually quite a campaign reporting, but to sometimes that can happen with these narratives, and we've seen it with the underdog story here. And I think that there's some evidence maybe that we're getting from our own U.S. military sources and national security sources about the Russian stalling and it not going the way they expected. But as you said, there's also a sense that that's going to change soon. So that narrative is going to probably turn in a really tragic way. How does the story change then? There's also challenges that we see a lot with, how to report a story when you can't get around to see. There's curfews, there's difficulty getting access to different kinds of sources. How do you piece that all together? And so for one of the things as viewers that we have to deal with is how good a job are the networks or other news organizations doing, giving us a whole picture, a holistic picture of what's happening, not just the tactical or the human interest, but really the bigger strategic sort of implications, what's happening diplomatically, which is a much more difficult story to cover, the soft news story instead of the hard news story. News generally tends to have a hard news bias to it, and we see that, I think, a little bit here. But this has also been a story of really high level, pretty successful diplomacy in many ways. That's a much more difficult story to report, and yet it's critical to understand. So some of those patterns that we see play out, we've seen here as well.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I've been watching it, and my first book was about war. I wrote a book about the war on terror, and the title of my book was "Every Man in This Village is a Liar," because one of the first things that you realize when you cover war is that nobody is ever going to tell you the truth about what they're doing in a war zone. So you're very dependent on trying to see things yourself, trying to get good firsthand information. And I feel like watching Ukraine, one thing that's interesting is you always have to look and see where are the bulk of the reporters getting access, like what are their access points? And I see in Ukraine, it's through the Ukrainians, like almost all of the US media that we're seeing is coming from a Ukrainian perspective. We're getting very little from the Russian side. Russian state media, we aren't really seeing that either. I've seen Sergei Lavrov giving some statements that seem to be pretty divorced from what is actually happening. So I have a feeling we're not really getting a very authentic view into this war. I feel like we're getting a lot of information, and there's a lot of cool stuff that they can do now with technology. Like the New York Times is sort of posting all these really interesting things. Like they'll have, satellite footage of a convoy of tanks going toward Kiev. And so you have this really intriguing piece of information, but it's not really like connected to all the other information that we're seeing. So you kind of feel like you have these pieces and you're sort of, as a consumer of the news, trying to put them together into a coherent puzzle. And I think that is not a great method of coverage for a war. I mean, I know it's interesting, we used to do these things called lead-alls. I'm sure Tom will know much more than me about lead-alls, where you would get all the reporters who were anywhere in the conflict zone would all kind of contribute to one big story. And you would get the story and it would kind of say, this is what's happening. Somebody would take all these pieces and synthesize them. And I feel like starting with Syria, I have the same feeling with Syria, where you're just getting all these videos and all these pieces and you see all this stuff on social media, but after a couple of weeks, you go what actually happened? I feel like I took in all these bits of information, but I didn't get a story. I didn't actually get a story out of this. And so that's what I did in Ukraine. Sorry? Did someone say something?
I think so. I'll just make sure he's on mute.
Oh.
We get different stories. We get stories about suffering. We get stories about bravery. We get those types of stories, some of which are real, some of which are propagandistic, some of which are something a little bit of both.
Well, there's a huge amount of propaganda in this model. I mean, it's very uncontrollable. And I feel like, in Georgia, I covered the war in Georgia, which is somewhat similar to this war. It was the opposite. Most of the journalists were with the Russian side. Journalists went into the Caucasus, kind of coming down from Moscow and then crossed over into the breakaway territories. I was in Georgia and I drove into the breakaway republics, so I saw a lot more of what was going on. And I was able to report on the militias, and I was able to see that there was a certain amount of almost sort of ethnic cleansing style activity going on with these Russian-backed militias who were roaming around the republics. But the reporters who came in with the Russian military were just taken to very specific spots and shown very specific things. And they didn't really get as much of the story. And I think it's interesting at this time, I don't think anyone is with the Russian military. I haven't seen that reporting. So there's not really an effort on the part of Russia to like take, kind of take control and present some kind of view, which I think is in itself interesting. Like, why are they not doing that? They've done it before. Anyway, those are all my kind of questions that I have.
There's also been similar with embedded journalism.
Yeah.
That you both, but I know you were doing it, right?
No, I wasn't, I didn't
I
know that.
was, yeah.
Tell me about it.
So the embedding, you did, so the embedding program, like in Iraq, went through different phases, the initial invasion phase, but then later, and then there was this period where you didn't have to be embedded, you could go around, and almost Dexter Copeland sort of wrote a good book about this sort of transition. And then all of a sudden it wasn't secure enough and you had to be embedded for your own security. And the great journalists were the ones that could rise above this sort of tunnel vision that you get when you're being, for good reasons, eventually you led around or for your own safety, but it's a different story and that access creates a story.
You never have to embed. That's always a choice. I think the best thing is to have perhaps some people embedded and some people not embedded.
Yeah.
That's what the New York
Yeah.
Times and other papers found. And again, there's one takeaway from all three of us. It's that you have to be aware of the individual TikTok image or tweet, whatever. And that the great news organizations have embedded reporters. They have reporters in the various capitals. They have people working Intel, State, White House. And then, as Megan said, either in a lead all or a package, you bring all those threads together and you weave a tapestry that tells the whole story. And if SMPA students should learn anything, it's just, the internet is narrowcast, it's not broadcast. It brings you only what you already know you want to know. And I would just urge all of you to not look at the individual threads, but to be your own weavers and pull together as much as you can to create the bigger picture.
But I think the three of you are showing us a very interesting, let's say, parallel, probably the paradox. On the one hand, the way the news organizations approach this in a more organic way, the way that you cover, but that seems to be sort of invisible probably to the average viewer that gets all the snippets from a story from different news organizations, social media, etc. And that seems to me, what you just mentioned here, the way that news organizations plan the coverage, of course, depending on resources, access, and all the other stuff. How it is being done right now from your knowledge from the insights, the way that major news organizations are sort of approaching the coverage a week into the invasion?
Well, I'm no longer a newspaper management nor a reporter, but I think you can see it if you read. There are reporters in the various towns in Ukraine that are under attack. Not any of them that have fallen. They have them along the border doing the refugee story. Reporters at NATO headquarters, Washington, Paris, London. So, and that's why this is a different conversation, but the demise of American newspapers and the narrowing of the number of papers that can do it right is bad for all of us. Because Megan's alma mater, the LA Times, can do it. The New York Times can do it, the Washington Post. My dear alma mater that sent me to Moscow 30 years ago, I don't want to say they can't do it, but they don't do it. And so there's fewer and fewer news.
That means the Chicago.
No, I'm sorry,
Chicago.
the Chicago Tribune, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
The Chicago Tribune. There are fewer and fewer news organizations that can do this weaving, this gathering, this curating, this synthesis. And that's a shame.
Yeah, I think if you can do it for yourself, we have so much more information that we can get. Like I enjoy Twitter. Like I really enjoy following news stories on Twitter because I get so many different pieces. I see videos and I feel like I have enough experience that I can kind of evaluate them almost automatically and kind of sort them in my mind. But I don't think most people can do that because they didn't spend years dealing with information and propaganda and understanding like, where is this coming from? So I don't know. It's like there's this great possibility, but I do feel like for the average news consumer, you're not really getting much of an understanding of what's happening. Like, I don't know. I think we've really had a lot of like strange information floating around. I think that we're mostly hearing from Ukraine. Some of the things I'm like, how would they, like, where is this coming from? Maybe it's true, but is that really true? There's things like the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry releasing text exchanges between a supposedly from a Russian soldier and his mother, and it was very emotional, but I was kind of like, is that real? Like, where is that coming from? Like, where did you get that? Why are, I have these questions as I'm looking at it, and I wonder what we're actually Like how much of this is just kind of like propaganda and kind of intelligence operations and, I don't know.
I think one thing to answer this question, Sylvia posed a little differently. For one thing, direct answer to your question is a lot of times it depends on the medium. So cable's going to cover it differently than a network newspaper, differently than a newspaper, differently than a weekly newspaper versus a smaller one. But one thing that we're seeing in recent conflicts where we have social media involved, and definitely in this conflict, is news organizations that have the resources to do so, spending a lot more of those resources to fact check and to verify, especially images.
Yeah.
We've had, as we have for the last 15 years at least, we've had a lot of instances where, you're talking about the conversation supposedly between the soldier and his mother, where we see video and it turns out, oh, well, that was from 2015 or that was from 2007 in Moscow or something like that. And so, the Times has a visual verification desk, and their job is to, geolocate all the images before they run with them. There's a good story in the Post, I think actually this morning, they're doing that, or House of the Networks are doing that. CNN is doing that type of thing. So the places that have the resources to do it, that's a really great kind of newish. It's not totally new to this conflict, but it is newish, and but it's very challenging as well. But on Twitter, we don't necessarily which is about Twitter, because I get a lot of my news from Twitter too, and it's a great resource if you have the right filters on, but you also have to have a filter in your own head against confirmation bias
Right, of course. Yeah.
and everything else.
And also the need to ask the second and third question. There's two Twitter photos that are powerful. One was of one of these very expensive yachts that was said to be seized by the French government to punish an oligarch close to Putin. So putting aside whether that's true or not, you have to ask, well, how badly does this oligarch gonna miss his yacht? Enough to cross Vladimir Putin? I don't know that that's enough. I mean, well, and there's another one of protests in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Trust me, the photograph was at night and all of these people massed protesting the war. Okay, fair enough. But the next question is, how widespread is that? That entire photograph is 0.0000001% of the Russian population. So you have to ask the second question and the third question.
So I was trying to figure out how long it's going to take us to talk about the fog of war here. So, Sean, do you think that this is working differently, given sort of the scattered, fragmented nature of sort of the way that multiple actors are covering and trying to influence public opinion on this? Is that an essentially new component of this?
No, I think that's as old as war, propaganda and the attempt to manage and control the information space goes back millennia.
But it's much more difficult right now, given what you guys already have described.
I think what it is there's different tools now. But that said, a huge difference in this current era is that it's much easier to make something look real or to pass it off as real. As really from this moment, or even to do a deep fake and create something out of nothing, or out of composites or something like that. And so it is a much more challenging environment for news organizations or anyone else, including intelligence agencies, to be able to figure out what is real and what isn't. And even just the selective release of information. Some of the examples that colleagues have brought up are examples that are kind of, essentially propaganda. Everyone's got a story, a narrative that they're trying to push here. The Ukrainians have theirs and the Russians have theirs. And yes, the Russians are bad actors in many obvious ways. You don't want to, equate the two sides in that regard. But at the same time, there are challenges for, especially news organizations, since that's what we're focusing on, to make sense of that. And those are some of those challenges. The technology is definitely advanced beyond even just 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, what it's capable of.
I've read in the last week a number of very, I would say, hopeful arguments that sort of Putin is losing the disinformation war. In fact, New York Times piece recently said Putin no longer seems like a master of disinformation. Is that a rush judgment? Is that hopeful? Is there enough evidence to support anything like that? Tom, maybe?
I guess I would say, Sylvia, you used the right word. It's a premature judgment. I mean, I think what the article was talking about is that the Biden administration made a rather fascinating, they wanted to do a good thesis, this is it, on releasing a lot of intelligence that they had gathered about Russian planes, the false flag, the claims that Russians inside Ukraine were being massacred.
Surely.
Yeah.
All those sorts of things. And it's a difficult thing, one, because it goes to sources and methods. How did the US know what the Russia propaganda campaign was going to be? And two, at the risk of understatement, this country has a rather grim record regarding intelligence to make the case for war, right? But I think so that argument made the point that in this case, it really did, I don't want to say Trump Putin, that's a bad word association, but it sort of outmaneuvered Putin at his own game. But let me assure you, Vladimir Vladimirovich is a very clever man, and he has a lot more at his disposal, including, as I said, escalation dominance. He can bring all the force to bear that he wants. At the end of the day, that's what matters.
I mean, I also think you have to ask, like, which audience are we talking about? Is he losing internationally? Is he losing domestically? Like, I don't think he's losing domestically. I think he's doing pretty well there. Just, I mean, I guess, I don't know, like, nobody really knows, but, I think there are some signs that there is a significant amount of support inside Russia for this war that, despite the protests. I'm not sure that that really represents mainstream Russian opinion at this point. And internationally, I think we lost it a long time ago. I think that he's had kind of a bad reputation for quite many years now. So that's the question. And I also speaking about the disinformation and the way that the sort of US government was interacting with journalists in the lead up to the invasion. I don't know. I didn't love it, I have to say, as a journalist. I felt like we were getting kind of triangulated into their conflict with Russia in a way. Of course, journalists always are in that position, and maybe it's because I've been out of Washington for most of my career, so this kind of thing is not, is still relatively new to me and not very appealing. But I, especially coming off some of the recent things like the Iraq invasion and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that, Kabul wasn't going to fall. I feel like with these intelligence failures hanging over us that we've reported, we as an industry, somewhat credulously, then it was sort of like, here's some more information. There was that famous confrontation with, who was the State Department reporter with Ned Price? You know what I'm talking about. The AP State Department reporter was really pushing him and saying, where did you get this from? I want, what, you can't just sort of come out here and say this. And I felt heartened by that, because I thought at least somebody is like asking harder questions and not just kind of going, okay, the State Department says this and I'm going to repeat it. Because I think at this point in our history, it's very hard to accept it so credulously, so
Yeah.
I found it problematic personally. I don't know.
I think that there's an interesting sort of parallel to previous wars, although a lot of the research in this area is about America, is about wars that America is actually fighting, and that's a big difference in this case. It explains a fair number of things that one might talk about, but one of these sort of patterns that we see in coverage of the lead up to or the early stages of a war that America is involved in is overly credulous reporting of government claims. The Iraq case being an obvious example, but Vietnam as well as others. But this is a slightly different case because US forces aren't involved, but as you say, there has been a little bit of that as well, or difficulty with verification. I also want to pick up on something that Megan said that I think is really important, which is that a lot of times in war coverage, one of the things that coverage loses sight of when we think about the big picture is everything gets framed through this very narrow prism of the war itself, or maybe international relations, diplomacy and things like that, and loses sight of the domestic concerns, issues, pressures, public opinion, et cetera. There was actually a good piece, I believe it was today, in the Post online section called The Monkey Cage, which is a really important part of the Post for people like us that are interested in what research has to say about current events. And it was a feature in the Post started by GW professors 15 years ago or so. And it's written for, sort of interested lay people. brings in research. And they were talking specifically about your question about how this is playing in Russia.
Right.
And the piece was all about how in Russia, independent news organizations aren't, which are being shut down, and that's a real problem. But that it's possible that in the West, we're making a bigger deal out of the impact of that because in Russia, according to these scholars who study it, they actually kind of like state-run media for a variety of reasons that they get into here. And so it's actually playing out fairly well, not to discount the protests and other
Right.
things happening, dissatisfaction may be there, but from a media standpoint, it may be a different story than we expect.
Oh, for sure. I don't know that we know exactly what the story is, but I'm sure that it is not what we are thinking it is.
And I think that you should discount the protest. That's my point. The Twitter picture of a plaza in St. Petersburg is not the whole country. I'm on email almost every day with dear friends who live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And to be sure, they are a finite cohort of people who befriended an American correspondent during the years of the Soviet Union. That said, there is a growing reluctance, and a couple have even said, Tom, we have to just stop doing it for a while. And so I don't know how we're going to get accurate public opinion or really know what's going on across the Russian population.
That's right. And I also had a note, a friend of mine wrote and said, what did she say? She said they've outlawed the word war, I assume like in the media, and Medvedev just floated bringing back the death penalty. She's like, so that's where we are.
Yeah, it's an
So, I mean, I think
authoritarian
it's-
state. I mean,
Of course, but
yeah.
I mean, but it hasn't been that authoritarian. I mean,
Right.
there may be like an increasing atmosphere of cracking down. And also we're talking about like city people. I mean, you have to look at like the Russian reality of like many smaller cities, rural areas where people really only have access to state TV. So and that's the only message they're gonna get. So, I don't know.
I'd like to go to the audience here on Zoom. Any questions, thoughts?
Yeah, so I was wondering, you talked a little bit at the beginning about how like the Russian side of the stories are really being put out. They haven't really put any reporters out in the field with their military and stuff.
Foreign reporters. I don't know if they have Russian state reporters. I don't know. I haven't seen the coverage. I haven't had a chance.
I was wondering what you guys thought about the West decision. I know a lot of governments around the world are either blocking or banning the Russian state news, RT and RT-TV. RT America just functionally laid off all of their staff and closed their doors. They're not going to be broadcasting in America anymore. I was wondering what you guys thought about that, and if you think that was kind of the right move.
Go
Who wants to go first?
That was a heavy sigh, so.
I feel torn about it. That's why I was sighing. I actually feel a little bit divided about that. I don't have a clean opinion because I don't really like RT. I do think I know it's state-run propaganda. I also don't really like cracking down on speech in any form. So I'm not quite sure. I'm still kind of turning over in my own thoughts where I think RT falls in that picture. So I don't know.
As always, I'm sure I'll get in trouble here, so why not go for it? It's a cliche, but some of my best friends are Russian news people, right? And some of them are really, really terrific. I do think that it's perfect. Like, I spent 2 years covering the war in Bosnia, and the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks all committed war crimes, no doubt about it. But I do think you have the right to make an assessment between the behavior of the aggressor and the behavior of the victim. And so this is a little complicated, but applying that to the Russian media, RT is a propaganda outfit as described by the US government. TASS, while still a state news service, TASS covers events here at GW, events I sponsor. Reporting's terrific. It's straightforward, it's factual, it has a focus on Russia issues, but of course it should. And it's a way for my project, at least, to get to millions of Russian readers to understand how the American media covers national security. So as long as Silvio gives me the proxy, I'm never going to ban TASS from my meetings, but I think RT is a different character.
Yeah,
And I
RT
think we
is
have the
not-
right to choose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Megan and I assume Tom, I tend to be a free speech absolutist myself, but I kind of come down the way you do exactly like that, RT is a different animal. It's interesting though, because years ago, when RT America first started here in Washington down the street, it was a place during a recession where GW graduates could find a job. And the interesting thing about the work they did at that time, at least, was that the news that came from RT mothership was just straight propaganda, nonsense, conspiracies, and all that sort of stuff. The stuff that they had the reporters, like the people our students do, our former students do, it was straight news, but it was news that made America look bad. It was about race relations and things like that, but they knew were stories that were going to, expose the dark underbelly of America and things like that. But it was a slightly different animal. And I don't think RT America stayed that way. So, and they closed shop about 2 hours ago, as you pointed out. But I think RT itself is a different animal.
But if we say we're free speech absolutists and then we're like, accept this one thing,
Right.
like, it's
But you're
like
obviously not
somehow,
absolute.
I mean, the reality is that state TV there's a lot of state media that we don't ban. BBC is state media, Jazeera is state media. We ourselves have Voice of America all over the world. You guys know, I mean. we
But it's
put
not
out
just
our
that they're
own-
state media, it's that it's a pure propaganda.
I know, it's just like, the problem for me is like, who's deciding? So, and who gets it, where do you draw that line? And if you start drawing that line, then where does it go? I don't know, because I really don't like RT and I completely agree that it's propaganda, but I'm not sure that, I'm not sure I can embrace the show. I think it's a really good question. I don't know the answer.
And I think also we need to remember decisions made by Google, Apple, Spotify to ban Russian TV and Sputnik. So the question is, who makes the decision, whether private companies or
Yeah.
not? What are the grounds for that? Are they consistent in the decisions?
Yeah.
Do they ban all, let's say, state-owned propaganda machines, or in this case, and that raises all kinds of questions.
I mean,
about-
that's like a whole other question. Right?
Exactly right,
Yeah,
exactly
Like, I
right.
mean, this whole drift in the US towards banning different kinds of information is troubling, I think.
Well, I think,
Well, European Union too, just to,
Oh, yeah, I don't
well,
know.
I think in terms of the
not only American companies.
Yeah.
in terms of the tech platform question, I think that, and we have people here that are better experts on that than I, but I think that in that case, the usual approach, or the approach that is advocated by people who would advocate for these sorts of things, is that it's usually not a matter of just banning an entire person or company or something like a news organization. It's trying to get rid of speech online that is misinformation or disinformation or conspiracy theories and things like that. If someone's a serial offender, like say the former president of the United States, then at some point they get deplatformed. That's controversial. Deplatforming the president, I think, is a controversial thing to do, no matter who it is. That doesn't mean it shouldn't have happened, but it's a different question. But in terms of something like RT, I think that what the tech platforms are trying to balance is this incremental approach, and then at what point do you cross the line that we just can't trust you. You're putting out so much disinformation that it's leading people to die, or is code misinformation, or so.
Yeah, but some of the COVID misinformation ended up being true.
Some, but that's
Some of it did. I mean, I'm just saying that there is a question, I think, about drawing these lines. I don't know.
I think it's another chapter of the question
it's
of free
another-
speech, especially in situations of war and conflict. Who makes decisions upon what grounds, right? Also, Twitter label journalists around the world who work for RT as freelancers within the same, and many of them reacted sort of against that decision by Twitter, because labeling them just like a mouthpiece for RT, even though they are like, part-time or freelancers working for them. Sean, could you talk a little bit about sort of the narratives of heroes and victims in the war, the Zelensky videos that became sort of hugely influential and viral? I mean, is that new? Not in this. I mean, in the sense of the technology, the platform, the narrative.
So I think that what we're seeing is an extension of something that we've seen, in the media age in modern warfare, which is iconic images, or images that evoke especially human suffering, that are ways of telling a narrative, a certain narrative, and things like that. So in terms of like iconic images, I think one of the things that you see, for instance, is a through line between images from World War II of people celebrating liberation in Paris and Sicily and places like that, to the Berlin Wall falling, to the fall of the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square in 2003. which have this sort of achieve a kind of iconic status that gives them greater meaning. In that case, the meaning of victory. So you have this victory frame after the statue of Saddam falls that doesn't obviously, with hindsight, match reality, right? And we see that colleague, Professor Williamson, and I did a paper with a student, colleague farm student, who's now Professor John Various, that showed the way in which coverage literally changed after the statue fell because of a lot of that narrative. In this case, I think a couple of things that we've seen have been interesting. One is, in terms of iconic images, a through line from the tank man at Tiananmen Square to an image that has gotten a lot of circulation this war, which is Ukrainians stopping a tank by standing in front of it. And actually a couple of different instances of this that I think is interesting, the way that that's developed a certain currency. Now, if we remember, that didn't end well in Tiananmen Square. Apparently, we don't know, but it doesn't seem to have ended well for that person either. So we'll see how that plays out. The other thing you mentioned, though, was the Zelensky videos, which are this sort of brave, heroic narrative, and justifiably so. One of the things that I think is interesting about those is, first of all, this is someone who comes from a media background. He's a celebrity. And so he knows how to use the media. And so he's very adept at it. Not just social media, but television, all media. And he really plays that well. Also, one of the net effects of this is that it provides a central character in the story, and that's him. And it brings with it a whole lot of meaning. And so it's much easier to sort of identify for outsiders what the story is and who the hero, who the star is, and what that means, right? And then third, the contrast between the images of him in this way with this very wooden photo ops that Putin is doing, the long tables and all these things that become sort of a joke, a tragic joke, and mean, yeah. And so I think there's a lot. It's a very savvy way in which he's using these images to tell a story, to give proof of life videos, to inspire his people, to rally the EU and Americans and all that sort of thing, but also to contrast with his main enemy and to make a message out. It's really fascinating.
Utterly interesting, just one kind of asterisk if I could. The thread of images you talked about, brave Ukrainians stopping Russian tanks. My question would be, are the people still standing there, and are those tanks still stopped, or are they encircling Kyiv?
Yep, exactly.
Let's go back to you guys. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. So I've seen some outlets, including NBC, be quick to pick up some signaling from Ukrainian intelligence, including numbers on casualties, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles taken. And a lot of other experts have been quick to point out that this data is likely very fuzzy. It's no way to really verify it. Do you see any value in outlets like NBC forwarding these messages from the Ukrainian government, and should they be doing that?
Well, I don't know about the specific story you saw on NBC, but just to be clear, I've seen reporting on what the Russians are claiming as well, which is a tenth of what the Ukrainians are. And there's the tendency to say, oh, it must be somewhere. It's probably somewhere in between. I find every time I see a number like that, a casualty number, or how many planes have been shot down or something, or especially when it's coming from the U.S. intelligence agencies or the department, I basically ignore it. At this stage, I just don't see. Sort of Megan was saying about some other things. I don't know how they would know. I don't, I mean, maybe the U.S. intelligence agencies do, or have a good sense of it, but I don't really trust that I'm not getting a spin on that, regardless of the Russians or Ukrainians or.
There's no good way that the Ukrainians, that I can think of, that the Ukrainians would know how many Russians have been killed at this point. I mean, they might have some, if they're really organizing and wasting their time, gathering all the information from all the different units. I don't think they're doing that, but even in that case, it would be so imprecise. So
Even the civilian casualties is a rough estimate.
yeah, I mean, I think but should they be reporting it? I mean, it doesn't really hurt anything. I think if it's framed properly to say this is what the Ukrainians are saying, this is what the Russians are saying, and then you can say, we don't know where the numbers are coming from. You can kind of explain some of that to your audience. I think transparency is really the key.
Let me ask a question coming from Andrew Springer, who actually is an alum and a member of our National Council. Here's the question, probably for everybody. What advice does the panel have for those of us already working in digital news and are going through churning out these individual threads daily? I should note, Andrew says, I took Professor Aday's media and work class 13 years ago and got a C. Andrew is doing very well. He has a very interesting and nice career. So it's not the end of your career to get, a C.
So I guess I better take that. First of all, Andrew, it's great to hear from you.
That's a really tough grader.
One of my favorite people, I would like to say, and a great journalist. I don't know, it was a bad week maybe for me. I don't know. Basically, no one's gonna sign up for my class next fall. But anyway, Andrew's great. So what advice? Well, there are a lot of journalists and people who study this, who put out a lot of great advice on that. I'm sure my colleagues have firsthand advice. I will say that there's a group at the University of Washington called the Center for Informed Public, and they, among others, and some of their faculty, put together sort of a list of how to report or how to verify information, both for journalists and for the rest of us. How do we deal with this information? Things like go slow. Take your time with information. Don't rush to judgment. Be careful of any unusual sources you're not familiar with. Also, be careful of sources you are familiar with that are spreading information to you. With Facebook example, it's a trusted source. It's your aunt, and you like her, and she's always put stuff up that you agree with, and so you pass it on. But it turns out you passed it on because again, the confirmation bias problem is what you wanted to think, and so be careful with that as well. Images can be taken out of context. Be careful that you have a sense of where they come from. For journalists, that's what we were talking about before about the verification desk. And, standard journalism 101, making sure you have multiple sources, that you can actually find a source for this information. There are a lot of images that are going to, especially I think coming up in the next few weeks, that are going to be really particularly gruesome and create a kind of emotional reaction. Those tend to be shared more quickly. They also represent, not always, but they can also be a core part of misinformation campaigns, precisely because they have emotional appeal. Be careful how you share those, in addition to ethical questions. So there's just a lot of advice out there about, for journalists especially, just to defer to you guys on that, but about verification and multiple sources.
So just very quickly, 2 rules I've learned the hard way. First, I learned from the American military. First reports are always wrong. Second, I learned as a night police reporter in Chicago, if your mother says she loves you, check it out.
I actually was curious to ask Tom, because Tom was doing more reporting before I was, and I feel like I have the impression that there are now a lot fewer journalists, that safety concerns have taken on a more pronounced role in some of the staffing decisions. I know my first war was Afghanistan in 2001, and I just went in. I didn't have any security training. I was a national correspondent. I got them borrowed. It was crazy. Like, this would not happen now, because now all the big newsrooms have security consultants, there's meetings, there's liability consideration, like everything is very carefully done. But I can't help but feel that the upshot of that has been that we get a lot less information. What do you think? I feel like there's, like when Kabul fell, the New York Times pulled their staffers out. They had no staff on the ground when Kabul was falling, when the airport was in chaos.
Well, two things. One, they are back.
I know, of course they are, but this is just.
And my friend and colleague, TM Gibbons Neff, did fly back to help affect the safe departure.
I'm not disparaging any of these journalists. These are like administrative decisions that are getting made. Syria was very understaffed. They were killing reporters, Marie Colvin died. People got really spooked even before that. And after that, I feel like staff, foreign staff stopped going in at some point.
So I was having the same discussion this afternoon with Frank Sesmo, another professor here, a great guy, veteran journalist. And we were having the same conversation. And again, people think I'm glib, but this is from the heart. Dead reporters miss deadlines.
Yeah.
That's it. End of story. So you have to keep them alive, you have to protect them. And if that means being out of Kabul for a couple of weeks, that's my vote.
But I have a question for you on this, and well, both of you, but so one of the things that came up, particularly when Foley was assassinated by ISIS, was a problem related to what you're talking about, which is for freelance reporters who don't have the protection, in addition to not having healthcare and that sort of thing, because they're a staffer, not having the kind of protection that a staff writer would have, or staff reporter would have, since you have a lot of experience on the staff, but as a freelancer, you talk about walking into Afghanistan in 2001.
Right, but I was on staff then.
Okay, so
Yeah.
but you have freelance, right?
I've never freelanced in a war zone. No.
So this is a real challenge, though,
Yeah.
is for freelancers, they don't have any of this. It's even more of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, what ends up happening is if no one is gonna staff it with staff journalists, inevitably, like, there's going to be some freelancer that's gonna rush into that void, because at the end of the day, people do want those pieces. I think newsrooms have gotten more careful and aware of the problem. I think that, I know that I work with, I'm a contributing editor at 1843, which is the Economist news feature magazine, and I know that we had a big discussion about providing the people who were going to freelance for us in Ukraine with different kinds of security and equipment, and also just like, contacts, ways to get out. So I think it has evolved, but it is true that what ends up happening is that some of the more dangerous things you still cover them, but they end up getting covered by a freelancer, which is okay, but it's just different. I feel like when you started out, it must have been much more free. Because even when I started out, it was much more free, and I think it's been closing slowly.
No, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Let me change so slightly the angle of the conversation. There are so many topics here, questions on Zoom, which is the different ways in which citizens, organized or not, are participating in multiple aspects of information, disinformation, communication. And one is, this question is for you, Tom, we will discuss this, which is the question of participatory warfare. As you know, the Ukrainian government called citizens from around the world to become sort of an IT army for hacking Russian operations. I saw an article that supposedly 170,000 people signed up. What are your thoughts on that, given your vast expertise in covering military issues, cyber attacks, etc.?
Right, it's a great question, Silvio, and make no mistake about it, Ukraine has thousands of incredibly educated, well-trained computer science people. There are a lot of American companies who have huge remote offices in Ukraine because they can pay them less and the work is just as good. The concern here, when you deputize citizens to carry out cyber hacks on a country like Russia, and you can play out the scenario, could a guy in Kyiv start World War III? There are probably hackers in Ukraine who are good enough to turn off the power grids in parts of Russia. I don't know whether they can turn on and off electric, dams or power plants, but when you do that, it is such a slippery slope and uncontrollable that scenario would be a great movie. Is going to keep me up tonight.
Sean, any thoughts on that before we go to the next question?
Not about the IT army. I mean, it's a mixed blessing, or a mixed bag, I guess, as Tom's pointing out. The reports are that they only report, they don't report the scary stuff, so that they've been pretty successful in some ways about attacking some Russian banks. Stuff that we can believe that story.
A few stories that some of that were very sort of upbeat, sort of thing, rather than
I
looking
think
at
there's
the.
another way in which we see the participatory part, which is citizen journalism, which is it's not an entirely new phenomenon, certainly, but it is something that is certainly aided by social media and small phones, and journalism is aided by that as well. But that, of course, raises issues with trustworthiness of sources and verification issues and things like that. But there are some things that we've seen coming out of this war, and we've seen in some previous conflicts, where citizens are able to upload a lot of really interesting, whether it's funny, it's trolling. There's a video that came out of Ukraine of a woman with a captured tank and showing you how to operate a tank. So if you come across a captured tank, this is how you turn it on and this is how you operate it. And just the ways in which they are sort of cheekily trolling the Russians. But I will say we had a project here for a number of years at GW. I was involved in called Blogs and Bullets through U.S. Institute of Peace. And at one point we had a conference and we had someone there who we had just done a report on Syria and social media in Syria and Twitter and things like that. We had someone there who told a story that I thought was really cautionary. And in brief, what he said is that this was somebody that journalists had a lot of trouble getting around Syria at this point. So 2012, 14, and it was during the height of the Civil War. And so this was a person that Western journalists really trusted because he had been a good source before. And so he was kind of a broker or a portal. And he would upload videos. He would get videos from Syria. He wasn't based there. He would get videos from Syria. And then he would upload them to his YouTube channel, which had hundreds of thousands of views, including Western journalists. At one point, he saw a video come up on another channel that was similar to one that had been sent to him of a protest in which people were chanting "Death to Alawite," which is Assad's family or group. And so he realized he didn't post that video because this is a point where the US was debating whether or not to send arms to the rebels and things like that. It's like, they don't want to, the reason they're not sending them is that they think it's going to be a bloodbath. So we can't upload that video. But then he saw it uploaded on another site that only had like a handful of people who followed it. And he was scared to death Western journalists were going to see it and upload it. So he called, they never did. But what he did is he told the people that sent him the video, hey, you can't say that. So a couple of weeks later, he got another video from the same people at a protest, and now they were chanting peace, but it was the exact same people. That video he posted, that video got picked up by reporters. And so the citizen journalism thing can be great. We get a lot of images that we wouldn't see otherwise from places journalists can't get. On the other hand, you always have our familiar verification charges.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left. Here's a question from Professor Jesse Holland, who of course teaches in our school. He says, many minority journalists are talking about what looks like racism coming from journalists talking about Russia and Ukraine, for example, saying this doesn't happen in Europe, unlike Africa and the Middle East, and calling Ukraine quote unquote civilized, unlike some third world countries, and saying having to flee their country doesn't happen to quote unquote Europeans. Can you talk about some of the language that's being used to describe what's going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's been terrible. I mean, I've been shocked by some of the things I've seen said. I mean, I think it's hard to speak extemporaneously the way that TV and broadcast people have to do, especially in stressful situations. So I try not to be too harsh with what, it's easy for any of us to say something, but when you're saying something, and I see it on Twitter too, I see a lot of journalists saying, I can't believe this is 2022 with images of people having to flee and refugees. And this is Europe, these people look like us. This is happening in a civilized place. And that kind of language is pretty devastating, even to me, who as a sort of white American person, just because of the experiences I've had covering wars with people who clearly were also civilized. And, the implication when you say something like that is that some countries are just kind of war prone and there's something in their culture that's a little bit inferior, they're violent. I mean, it opens up this sort of deep racist, kind of undertone that's not even very far under. I would say it's almost on the surface in some of these comments. So I don't know what to say. I think it's been awful. I'm glad that there's been a discussion of it.
I think that one thing that's important about this is that, and sad, is it's not individual, anecdotes where someone slipped up. I mean, saying you're live. I guarantee we don't slip up this way, but people make mistakes, whatever. It's more the pattern of it. We've seen so much of it in the first week. And we see ethnocentrism in coverage of previous conflicts as well. And some of the comments people are like, oh, these people, literally, these are things that were said. These are people with blonde hair and blue eyes. And they
don't look like refugees.
They don't look like refugees. These people are, this is a civilized country, things like that. And, the idea that, and usually some sort of contrast to, as you said, the Middle East, North Africa, or something like that. And the idea that, war is alien to Europe would be news to the History Channel. So,
Of course, I know, that's the other thing, and even like, that we haven't had any conflict in, I mean, you must be like, what are you talking about? You were in the Balkans, like,
1990s.
because you also see this stuff saying, well, we haven't had a conflict in Europe since World War II, and you're like, what? Like, Russia's had wars in the last like 10 years, what are you even talking about?
I mean,
Like, what-
It's a
what's
great
happening?
question, Silvio, and again, one should never try to get inside Putin's head, but my guess is he probably is surprised by this reaction. However, it represents latent racism. Remember, he flattened Grozny in Chechnya, and the world barely protested, and those were Muslims with darker skin. So I think he is really surprised that, oh, Europeans care about other Europeans, right? Because they certainly didn't step in when Grozny was literally.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes. I would like to give 1 minute to each of you for some final thoughts in regards. And we have I have lots of questions. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I'm sorry, but we have only 1 hour. Who wants to go first? So sort of some final thought, anything that we haven't covered or discussed that you can summarize in 1 minute.
I would just say that, we talked a lot about social media, and I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that, as in many things, we tend to exaggerate media's power and influence over, events and people, and war is definitely an instance of that. Media matter, they can be very important for obviously how we learn about things that we're not directly experiencing. And the social media aspect is exciting and it's interesting and in some ways novel and new, and so it's a part of the story. But at the end of the day, media and social media don't win and lose wars or start and end them. Armies and diplomats do, and that's how this is going to end, and it's probably going to get very ugly before it gets better.
Gregor?
I have no idea what to say in 1 minute. I think we're heading into,
You just published a great piece.
yeah, thank
Anything-
you.
yes,
Thank you for
it's a-
that.
It's a
Thank
great
you.
piece. Maybe of that, anything
Well, no,
that-
I think that what's in my mind is just that I think we're about to move into a different phase in the war. I think that probably the civilian evacuation is going to end up being a bit ominous, because I imagine that once, there's sort of a statement that the civilians have left, the pattern usually is then the bombardment gets very intense, and there will be fewer journalists, there'll be fewer firsthand reports, and there'll be a lot more people getting killed. So I think we're going to enter into a moment in the coming couple of weeks when everything that we've been talking about here is going to be, I think we're going to start watching this war a lot on social media with clips that are going to be really hard to verify. So that's what I think is happening.
So after these great global thoughts, I'll be very, very parochial. If any of the students want to continue this dialogue, I know we're all available via email conversation. And all I would say, as probably the newest staff member here at SMPA, what you're studying is never more important than it is today. Make no mistake, there is a fight out there between democracy and dictatorship. And I've worn body armor and I've been in armored vehicles, but I do believe that information, accurate, honest information, is the best defense of democracy. So keep studying hard, go out there and make the world a better place.
Thank you very, very much, all of you. And of course, thank you for you coming, and thank you for everybody who joined us on Zoom. This was a fantastic conversation to be continued. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.